If understanding your rights clearly, instead of just vaguely, is something that matters to you, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before you go, because that's exactly what this channel is built around, one real, specific legal topic at a time, explained in plain language without the unnecessary complexity. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, mostly because it tells me this kind of plain language legal content is actually reaching the people who need it, which is the entire point of doing this in the first place. All right, that's the ask. Let's keep going. There's a moment in nearly every traffic stop that almost nobody knows exists. A moment the law actually has a name for, and it happens right around the time the officer hands your license and registration back, or tells you your taillight's fixed now, or says, "All right, drive safe." And instead of walking away, they just stay. Maybe they ask one more question. Maybe they say, "Hey," before you go, and lean back into your window. And in that exact second, something enormous shifts in the legal relationship between you and that officer. Something most drivers never notice happening at all, because it doesn't come with a bell or a warning. It just quietly changes, and whether you know it changed is the entire difference between an encounter that ends cleanly and one that spirals into something much longer than it needed to be. Here's what I want you to walk away from this video knowing. Cold, without having to think about it under pressure, a traffic stop has a legal shelf life. It's built to last exactly as long as it takes to handle the reason you were pulled over, and not 1 second longer unless something specific and new happens to justify extending it. Once that original purpose is finished, the stop is supposed to be over, and if it isn't ending, you have real, meaningful ways to find out why, and real, meaningful ways to protect yourself in that space between done and you're free to go. Before we get into exactly how this works, if you want to actually understand your rights instead of guessing and hoping for the best next time you're sitting on the shoulder with your hazards on, hit subscribe right now, because that's exactly what this channel exists to give you. Quick note before we start. This is legal education and commentary, not legal advice for your specific situation, and some details shift state to state, but the core framework here comes from federal case law that applies nearly everywhere in this country. I want to talk for a second about why I think content like this actually matters, beyond just being interesting to talk about. There's a real meaningful gap between people who have easy access to legal knowledge, whether through education, profession, or family background, and people who don't, and that gap has real consequences in real situations. It's not fair, and it's not something any individual video is going to fully fix, but I do think there's genuine value in narrowing that gap even a little, one plain language explanation at a time, for anyone willing to spend a few minutes actually learning something instead of relying on guesswork or half-remembered fragments picked up secondhand. That's the actual mission behind this, as unglamorous as that sounds, not to turn anyone into a lawyer, but to close the specific, practical gaps that leave ordinary people at a disadvantage in moments that matter. All right, let's keep working on exactly that with today's topic. Country. Let's get into it. Let's start with the foundational rule, the one the Supreme Court actually laid out in plain language, because everything else in this video builds on top of it. A traffic stop is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment, meaning it has to be reasonable in both how it starts and how long it lasts. The stop is only justified for as long as it takes to address the actual reason for the stop, checking your license, registration, and insurance, running those documents, maybe writing a ticket or a warning, and once those tasks are completed, or reasonably should have been completed, the stop's legal justification runs out. Courts have described this using a phrase worth remembering. The stop can't be extended beyond the time reasonably required to complete its original mission. That sentence is doing an enormous amount of work, and it's the exact sentence this entire video is going to keep coming back to. So let's talk about what that mission actually includes, because it's a little broader than people expect, and understanding its actual boundaries is what lets you recognize the moment it's been exceeded. The mission of a routine traffic stop generally covers checking your license, checking for outstanding warrants, checking proof of insurance, and issuing whatever citation or warning is appropriate for the violation. Courts have also generally allowed officers to ask a handful of routine questions during this window: where you're headed, where you're coming from, because these fall within what's considered ordinary, incidental conversation during a stop, even though they're not strictly required to complete the paperwork. What courts have not generally allowed, once that mission is otherwise finished, is using the stop as an open-ended opportunity to investigate completely unrelated matters, without either your voluntary cooperation or a new, independent reason to suspect something else is going on. Let's talk about the specific moment when this all comes into play, because it's usually not subtle once you know to look for it. It's the return of your documents. It's the officer saying the ticket or warning is finished. It's a sentence like, "All right, that should do it," or "Here's your copy, have a good night." Any of these are strong signals that the original mission of the stop has been completed, and legally, this is the point where you become free to leave unless something new is happening. The problem is that almost nobody actually leaves the second they hear this, because it doesn't feel like permission has been formally granted. It just feels like the conversation paused, and that hesitation is exactly the gap where a lot of stops quietly get extended without the driver ever realizing there was a choice available to them. Let's talk about the single most useful question in this entire scenario, the one this video is really built around, because it does more to clarify where you actually stand than anything else you could possibly say. Am I free to go? This question exists precisely because the line between a completed stop and a continuing one isn't always announced clearly, and asking it directly forces the officer to either confirm that you're free to leave or articulate a new, specific reason why you're not. There's no bad outcome to asking this question calmly and respectfully. If the answer is yes, you now know clearly that you're free to go, and you can leave without any further conversation. If the answer is no, or if the officer hesitates and starts asking additional questions instead of answering directly, that itself tells you something important, which is that the encounter has shifted from a completed traffic stop into something else, and that something else needs its own independent justification. Let's talk about what that something else actually has to look like to be legally valid, because this is where a lot of the real substance in this topic lives. For an officer to extend a stop beyond its original mission, they generally need what's called reasonable suspicion of some additional, separate criminal activity. Not just a hunch, not just a feeling, but specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable officer to suspect something beyond the traffic violation itself is going on. This could be something like the smell of alcohol or drugs, visible contraband in plain view, inconsistent or evasive answers to routine questions, or specific behavior that genuinely stands out as suspicious beyond ordinary nervousness, which on its own, courts have generally said isn't enough by itself, since plenty of perfectly innocent people get nervous around police. If none of that exists, and the officer simply wants to keep talking, keep looking, or keep waiting for something to develop, that extension generally isn't supported by the same legal framework that justified the stop in the first place. Let's talk through what this actually sounds like in practice, because I want you leaving this video with real phrases ready to go, not just an abstract sense of the principle. If the officer has handed back your documents and the conversation seems to be winding down, am I free to go? Said calmly, not aggressively, just as a genuine, simple question. If the officer says yes, thank you, have a good night, and you leave, without lingering, without offering additional conversation, without feeling like you owe an explanation for wanting to go. If the officer says something like, just a couple more questions, without directly answering, I appreciate that, but I'd like to know first, am I free to go, or is there something specific going on? This isn't confrontational, it's just precise, and precision here is exactly what you want, because it forces clarity instead of letting the encounter drift. If the officer says no, you're not free to go, and states a specific reason, a K9 alert, something visible in the car, a specific new suspicion. Okay, I understand. I don't consent to any search, and I'd like to know if I'm being detained for something specific or under arrest. This sentence does two important things at once. It clearly withholds consent to search, which matters enormously for reasons we'll get into in a moment, and it asks the officer to clarify the legal basis for continuing to hold you there, which forces the encounter into more defined, more accountable territory. Let's talk specifically about consent, because just like with the doorstep scenario, consent is really the center of gravity for a huge portion of what happens once a stop stretches past its original purpose. Even after the mission of the stop is technically finished, an officer can still ask if you'd be willing to answer more questions, or if you'd be willing to let them search your vehicle, and you're allowed to simply say no. I don't consent to a search is a complete, valid, lawful sentence. And saying it doesn't create suspicion on its own, doesn't extend the stop on its own, and isn't obstruction in any way. A lot of drivers feel enormous pressure to just go along with an extended conversation once they're already sitting there, already having handed over their license, already feeling like the interaction has some kind of built-in momentum toward continuing. But none of that changes the underlying legal reality, which is that your consent has to be freely given, and freely given means you're allowed to withhold it. Let's talk about a scenario that comes up constantly and causes a lot of confusion: the drug dog, or K9 unit, because this is one of the most litigated pieces of this entire topic, and for good reason, since it sits right at the exact boundary we've been discussing. Courts have generally held that walking a drug-sniffing dog around the exterior of a vehicle during a legitimate, still ongoing traffic stop doesn't itself violate your rights, because it's treated as something that can happen alongside the ordinary tasks of the stop without necessarily extending it. But, and this is the part that actually matters most, once the mission of the stop is genuinely finished, meaning the ticket's written, the documents are back in your hands, and there's no independent reasonable suspicion of anything else, courts have generally said that continuing to detain you specifically to wait for a K9 unit to arrive, or to complete a sniff that wasn't already underway, crosses exactly the line we've been talking about this entire video. This is precisely why the timeline matters so much, and it's exactly why asking, "Am I free to go at the right moment?" can end up being the single most important thing you say during the entire stop. Let's talk about what happens if you ask that question and the officer's answer is vague, evasive, or simply doesn't respond directly, because this happens more often than you'd expect, and it's worth having a plan for it specifically. You can ask again, calmly, "I just want to be clear. Am I being detained or am I free to leave?" This phrasing forces a binary choice, detained or free, and there genuinely isn't a lawful third option sitting between those two. Even though in practice, the conversation can sometimes feel like it's floating in some undefined middle ground. If you continue to get an unclear answer, it's reasonable to simply state, "Respectfully, I'd like to leave now, unless you're telling me I'm being detained," and then proceed accordingly, based on whatever direct answer that finally produces. Let's talk about what being detained actually means once it's confirmed, because this changes what you should expect from the rest of the encounter. If an officer states directly that you're being detained, that means they believe they have the reasonable suspicion we talked about earlier, and detention can generally last as long as it reasonably takes to investigate that specific new suspicion, though it still has its own outer limits and still has to remain reasonable in scope and duration. This is different from arrest, which requires probable cause, a higher standard, and which comes with its own separate set of rights, including the right to remain silent, and the right to an attorney, which is worth explicitly invoking out loud if you believe you're actually being arrested, rather than simply detained. "I'm going to remain silent, and I'd like to speak with an attorney." Let's talk about unmarked cars and plainclothes officers, because this scenario adds a layer of uncertainty that a routine marked car stop doesn't have, and it's worth understanding clearly before it ever actually happens to you. If you're signaled to pull over by a vehicle without visible markings, without a light bar, without anything immediately identifying it as law enforcement, you're generally allowed to proceed cautiously rather than pulling over immediately in an isolated or poorly lit area. This isn't paranoia, it's a recognized, reasonable practice. Using your hazard lights to acknowledge you've seen them, slowing down, and driving to the nearest well-lit, populated area like a gas station or a police substation before actually stopping is something courts and law enforcement training materials themselves have generally acknowledged as reasonable caution, not evasion. Once stopped, if you're still unsure, you're allowed to ask, calmly, through a cracked window, for the officer to confirm their identity and show a badge, and you're allowed to ask to call the local police non-emergency line to confirm the stop is legitimate before rolling your window down further or stepping out. This single fact, that verifying legitimacy is a reasonable thing to do, rather than something that will be held against you, is worth genuinely internalizing, because the instinct in the moment is almost always to assume you simply have to comply immediately with whatever's happening, and that instinct isn't quite accurate here. Let's talk about DUI checkpoints specifically, because they work under a meaningfully different legal framework than an ordinary traffic stop, and the two get confused constantly. Sobriety checkpoints have generally been upheld by courts as constitutional, despite not requiring individualized suspicion for each stop, but only when they follow specific predetermined procedures, a neutral established formula for which vehicles get stopped, rather than officers picking and choosing at will, advance public notice in many states, and clear limits on how long each stop can reasonably take. If you're waved into a checkpoint, you're generally required to stop and provide your license and registration the same as any ordinary stop, but you're still not required to answer questions beyond that, still not required to consent to a search, and still not required to perform field sobriety tests, which in most states are voluntary rather than mandatory, even though officers don't always phrase the request in a way that makes that clear. Breath tests specifically carry their own separate rules under what's called implied consent law, meaning refusing one after an arrest for suspected DUI can carry its own administrative penalties like license suspension, entirely separate from the criminal case itself. And that distinction is worth understanding clearly, rather than assuming refusal carries no consequence at all, or assuming it's the same as refusing a voluntary field sobriety test before any arrest has even happened. Let's talk about what happens if you're stopped in a state that isn't your home state, because a surprising number of people assume, incorrectly, that different rules apply to them simply because their plates or license come from somewhere else. They don't. The Fourth Amendment travels with you across every state line, and the exact same framework we've walked through this entire video, the mission of the stop, the point at which you're free to go, the requirement of reasonable suspicion to extend things further, applies identically whether you're 5 minutes from your own driveway or 800 miles from home. What can change slightly state to state is things like whether recording requires notifying the other party, whether specific administrative rules apply to license suspensions, or how a given state's courts have interpreted certain edge cases. But the core constitutional floor underneath all of it doesn't shift depending on which state's road you happen to be sitting on. Let's talk about young or newly licensed drivers for a moment, because this scenario deserves its own direct attention, given how much more intimidating this entire situation understandably feels the first handful of times it happens. If you're a teenager or a new driver, everything in this video still applies to you in full, exactly the same as it applies to anyone else. But it's genuinely worth practicing these exact sentences out loud, at home, in a calm setting, before you're ever sitting on a shoulder with hazards blinking for the first time in your life. It's also worth having a specific, simple plan with a parent or guardian in advance, a text you send the moment it's safe to do so, a call you make once the stop is finished. Not because anything is expected to go wrong, but because having that plan already decided removes one more thing you'd otherwise have to figure out in a moment that already feels like a lot to process on its own. Let's talk about rental cars specifically, because this scenario comes up more than people expect and adds its own small wrinkle. If you're pulled over in a rental vehicle, particularly one rented under someone else's name rather than your own, it's worth having the rental agreement accessible and ready to show alongside your license, since officers will sometimes ask about it specifically, given how often rental vehicles come up in unrelated investigations. Being listed as an authorized driver on the agreement, or being able to reasonably explain your connection to the person who rented it, generally resolves this quickly, but it's exactly the kind of detail worth thinking through before a trip, rather than fumbling for during the stop itself. Let's talk about plain view, because this concept comes up constantly in how a stop can shift from routine into something longer, and it's worth understanding on its own terms. If something illegal is genuinely visible from outside the vehicle, in plain view, without any search having occurred, an officer generally doesn't need a warrant or your consent to act on what they can already see. This is different from a search, because nothing was searched for or opened to reveal it. It was simply sitting there, visible, the entire time. This is exactly why keeping your vehicle's interior reasonably tidy and free of loose, ambiguous items on visible surfaces isn't about hiding anything. It's simply about not accidentally creating a situation where something innocent gets misread from a quick glance through a window, becoming the exact kind of specific, articulable fact that can justify extending a stop well past its original purpose. Let's talk about body cameras and dash cameras from the officer's own side, because this matters for the same reason your own recording matters. In the large majority of departments today, officers are equipped with body-worn cameras, and that footage generally exists as an official record, separate from anything you capture yourself. If you ever believe a stop was handled improperly, extended without justification, or involved a search you didn't consent to, that footage can typically be requested, sometimes by you directly, and sometimes only through an attorney or a formal records request, depending on your state and department. And it's worth knowing this option exists rather than assuming your own recollection, or even your own phone recording, is the only version of events available afterward. Let's talk about what happens if the delay is simply technical rather than investigative. Because not every extended stop involves suspicion at all. Sometimes a computer system is slow, a database check takes longer than usual, a printer for citations is malfunctioning. These kinds of ordinary, good faith delays generally still fall within the legitimate mission of the stop, since completing the paperwork accurately is part of that mission, and courts have generally distinguished this kind of routine, unavoidable delay from a delay caused by pivoting the stop toward an unrelated investigation. If you're ever unsure which kind of delay you're experiencing, the same question still works exactly the same way, calmly asking whether you're free to go or whether there's a specific reason for the continued wait tends to clarify which category you're actually sitting in. Let's talk about something that trips a lot of people up specifically, the difference between silence and cooperation, because you can decline to answer additional questions while still remaining completely calm, completely polite, and completely non-confrontational the entire time. "I'd rather not answer any more questions right now" is a complete sentence. It doesn't need justification, it doesn't need an explanation of why, and it doesn't need to be softened with an apology, though there's nothing wrong with adding one if it feels more natural to you. I don't mean any disrespect, I'd just rather not answer more questions right now. Accomplishes exactly the same legal protection while keeping the tone warm, and warm and firm are not opposites here, the same way they weren't opposites in the doorstep scenario. Let's talk about your hands, your movements, and your general demeanor during this extended window, because practical safety matters just as much as the legal framework itself. Keep your hands visible. Keep movements slow and telegraphed. Avoid reaching for anything without clearly announcing what you're doing and why first. None of this changes your legal rights in the slightest, but it changes the practical texture of the encounter, and a calm, clearly visible, unhurried driver tends to have a fundamentally different experience than one whose movements read as unpredictable, even when both are equally within their rights. Let's talk about recording, because it matters here just as much as it does in every other encounter with law enforcement we've covered on this channel. In the vast majority of places, you're allowed to record a traffic stop, whether through your phone, propped somewhere visible, a dash camera already running, or simply stating out loud, "Just so you know, I'm recording this for my own records." This isn't about being adversarial, it's about creating an objective account of exactly what was said and exactly when, which matters enormously if the question of whether the stop was improperly extended, or whether consent was actually given, ever needs to be examined carefully later by someone other than the two people who were actually there. Let's talk about what happens after the stop ends, however it ends, because just like with every other scenario we've covered, the minutes right afterward matter more than people tend to expect. As soon as you're safely able to, write down or record a voice memo with everything you remember. The time, roughly how long the stop lasted from start to finish, what was said when your documents were returned, whether you asked if you were free to go and what the response was, whether a K-9 was involved and when it arrived, relative to the paperwork being finished, badge numbers or names if you caught them. Memory fades quickly, and if the legality of how long that stop lasted ever becomes a real question, your own contemporaneous notes, taken while the details are still fresh, become genuinely valuable. Let's talk about a related situation that deserves its own careful walkthrough. What happens if the officer says they're calling for backup or waiting on a supervisor once the original stop appears finished? This is worth watching closely, because waiting for backup or a supervisor, absent some independent reasonable suspicion justifying the wait, generally doesn't fall inside the legitimate mission of an ordinary traffic stop either. You can ask, the same way as before, calmly, "Is there a specific reason I'm still being held here?" And if the answer amounts to nothing more than procedure or convenience rather than a specific, articulable suspicion, it's worth noting that clearly in your own memory of the encounter for exactly the reasons we just walked through. Let's talk about passengers for a moment, because this scenario doesn't only involve the driver. Passengers in the vehicle generally have their own, separate right to ask whether they're free to go once the stop's mission is finished, and courts have recognized that passengers are also seized during a traffic stop, meaning the same basic framework of reasonable duration applies to them too, not just to the driver holding the wheel. If you're a passenger, and the stop seems to be dragging on well past its apparent purpose, you're allowed to ask the exact same question, in the exact same calm, direct way, "Am I free to go?" Let's talk about the emotional layer here for a moment, because sitting on the shoulder of a road with your hazards blinking, watching an officer walk slowly back toward their vehicle, only to return with more questions, creates a very specific, very uncomfortable kind of pressure, different from almost any other everyday interaction. There's a strong pull toward just going along with whatever keeps the conversation calm and moving forward, toward assuming that asking questions of your own might somehow make things worse rather than better. That instinct is completely human, and it's exactly why this kind of preparation matters. Sitting here now, calm, thinking it through in advance, rather than trying to invent a response for the first time, with your hazards on and your heart rate climbing. Let's talk about one more piece worth understanding clearly before we close. The difference between an encounter that's over and one that only feels like it should be. Sometimes an officer genuinely does have new, valid grounds to extend a stop. Something they noticed, something that came back on a check, something in plain view. And in those situations, the stop's continuation is lawful, even if it doesn't feel that way from inside your car. The tools in this video aren't about guaranteeing every stop ends the moment you want it to. They're about making sure that when there isn't a valid reason for the stop to continue, you have a clear, calm way to find that out, rather than simply sitting there indefinitely, assuming the conversation has some authority behind it that it may not actually have. Let's bring this all the way back together, because I want to leave you with one clear structure, rather than a long list of separate rules to try to remember individually under pressure. A traffic stop is only justified for as long as it takes to complete its original purpose: checking documents, running your information, issuing a ticket or warning. Once that purpose is finished, you're generally free to go unless something new and specific justifies keeping you there. The single most useful thing you can say, the moment the original purpose seems complete, is, "Am I free to go?" If the answer is yes, you leave, calmly and immediately. If the answer is no or unclear, you ask directly whether you're being detained, and if so, why, and you're allowed to decline consent to any further search or questioning the entire time, calmly, respectfully, without that refusal creating any suspicion on its own. Recording the encounter, keeping your hands visible, and writing everything down afterward all support this same underlying goal, which is simply making sure the encounter stays exactly as long as the law actually allows it to, and not one moment longer than that. Say the key sentences out loud once more, because saying them now, calmly, sitting somewhere with nothing at stake, is what turns them into instinct instead of invention later, right when you'd need them most. Am I free to go? I don't consent to a search. Am I being detained, or can I leave? I'd rather not answer any more questions right now. 4 sentences, calm and complete, ready whether that extended stop ever happens to you or not. If this gave you something you didn't have clearly in mind before today, hit subscribe, because there's more of this coming, one real scenario at a time, the kind of preparation that turns a confusing, drawn-out stop into something you can navigate calmly, instead of something that catches you completely off guard. Know exactly where that line sits, ask the question when the moment calls for it, and remember that once the mission's finished, the road ahead is yours to get back to.
All right, that's where we'll leave it for today. I hope this gave you something genuinely useful, not just interesting to hear, but something you could actually use if the right situation ever came up. That's always the real goal here, understanding you can actually carry with you, not just information you forget by tomorrow. Take care of yourself, know what's actually yours, and I'll see you in the next one.